morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank the IBWSS for their continuing support of the bulk industry. My name is Alexander Braun. I am the CEO of North America for Hillebrand. We are a company, we're the wines and spirits logistic company for the DHL group. I've been in this industry for about 24 years. And I think it's a great industry to be in, and we really feel part of this. We're not just executing, but I think we are part of this industry. First of all, I would like to say that, we say, or I say, there's always a good reason to drink, whether it's to forget or to celebrate. And I think our job is to make sure that we deliver your product when your consumer needs it. In this sessions today, we would like to talk about the trends, what the outlook is. We talk about capacity. We're going to talk about demand and some forecasts of what we are seeing for the future. So logistics industry, it's like a balancing act. So we decided to put this tango because it's a very delicate equilibrium which very rarely we find. If we look at, so we're in July, and unfortunately our numbers don't come as fast as we would like to. But if we look at the global container demand for the Q1 2024, it was up 7%. We're seeing in Q2 that continue to grow, predominantly out of Asia. There's been a big surge of requests and volumes, so export out of Asia into North America as well as North Europe. But at the same time, if we look at the container fleet growth last year, was about 8% growth, meaning that the shipping lines, if we add all the vessels that were deployed in the industry on top of the new orders that were put in, the fleet, the global fleet offer grew by 8%. Now these two numbers, they look like they're almost balanced. So we would think that everything would be great. Unfortunately, these indexes do not take into consideration the disruptions that we're seeing in the market. If we look at the global landscape, so whenever there is a checkpoint in the supply chain, we are seeing that the capacity shrinks. Starting from the Panama Canal, which probably some of you have heard, this Q1, it was unfortunately not functioning as it should, mainly because the locks of the Panama Canal, they work with fresh water, and there was a drought. And therefore, the shipping lines were forced to reduce the number of vessels that were going through the Panama Canal. And the vessels that were going through the Panama Canal actually had to be lighter, meaning less cargo was allowed to be on that vessel. Now, if you consider that about 5% of the global freight goes through that had an impact. Thankfully, the rainy season brought the water back. So we're seeing now the Panama Canal back to almost regular level. But unfortunately, with global warming, I think this is something we might see again in the future. Of course, if we talk about Suez, that's another problem that we have been seeing since December of last year. I think many of you will know about the Houthi attacks, and all the shipping lines decided to avoid using the Suez Canal and decided to go through the Cape of Good Hope. That means that there's longer transit time. If you think about a ship that's going from Shanghai to, let's say, North Europe, now, has to go around Africa, and shipping lines have told us it's about 10 to 15% more capacity that they had to inject to make sure they were able to offset this disruption. Now, the Strait of Malacca, which is basically Singapore, about 30% of the global volumes, they flow through Singapore. And of course, it's a very important hub. And as I was saying, with the surge that we've seen in the last few quarters, there is already some waiting time to get into Singapore, and the vessels are, being stuck there, and possible additional disruptions that could come. If we come closer to our ports, of course, is the ILA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's the International Longshore Association, which is renegotiating the contracts that they have with. It's the master contract that they have with the USMX. So this master contracts negotiation started in February this year. The contract will expire in September of this year. And unfortunately, the negotiation stopped in June. and they stopped because it was found that the port of Mobile, Alabama, they had some automated gates, and the unions decided to stop these negotiations. I mean, if they decide to strike, it would be a major impact, of course, for the East Coast and Gulf. This is, the negotiation of the renewal of this contract is for East Coast and Gulf ports. They are, heavily unionized, specifically New York and Houston more, but all of them are, going to be affected. So it's an election year, so we do hope that politics or politicians will do the right thing to avoid this disruption, mainly because all these points that we see on this map, the disruption will not take place only locally. So it'll have a ripple effect throughout the globe. We're looking at alternatives, but at the end of the day, if the strike happens on the East Coast, the West Coast is going to be congested, and actually the whole world or the global shipping will be affected by it. So if we look at the on-time performances, we went from pre-COVID almost 80% on-time performance. Then it dropped to 36% when nobody knew where the containers were and everybody was struggling to understand how to get the freight into the US or out of the US. And then after that, we started growing to almost 62% last year. Unfortunately, as I was saying, the Suez Canal closure, or not closure, but anyways, the disruption in the Suez Canal brought us down again to 53%. Now with the injection of additional freight, we are seeing picking up again, but disruptions is unfortunately affecting the on-time performance, and we're still far away from where we were on the pre-COVID level. So if we add where we started from, the capacity, existing capacity, the normal course of business of removing vessels from, the old vessels from the trade, and the delays and the congestions, you basically end up with a forecasted capacity that's below about 4.5 million TEUs. A TEU, it's a 20-foot equivalent unit, so than the expectation. Bottom line, this means that we need more vessels to ship the same amount of freight, just because they're sitting somewhere and not moving. In addition to that, as you probably are aware, there is a lot of environmental regulation that are being rolled out through all the governments around the world. So it's not only in Europe, it's not only in the US. I mean, definitely California started about 2015 with a clean air program. Europe this year, they started the ETS program, which is the European trade system. And all these initiatives are basically driving the shipping lines to either burn less or burn cleaner, which means burn less, they have to reduce the speed, and meaning longer transit time, or burn cleaner, which means they have more expensive fuel to buy. So what does that mean for you? I think it's additional cost for the shipping line, and unfortunately, as an importer or a product owner, probably this will reflect on additional costs for you. On top of that, we are seeing in the last few years a lot of concentration of the carriers. So there's been a lot of acquisitions, market acquisitions. This is the picture that we will see as of January 25th, 1st of January 25. Basically, the alliance between MSC and Maersk will stop, and they will part ways, and Maersk will join forces with Hapag-Lloyd. What it means is, if you look at this, they have about 7 carriers here, and they represent over 70% of the global freight. And what it means for us is there is less options, there is less competitiveness because, we have less players to negotiate with, and therefore it's going to be basically, a result for possible increases and unfortunately with, less good services that we have. What does this mean for the shipping line? All these costs that we saw, disruptions, is, this industry has always been more or less a break-even industry. And up until COVID, when shipping lines, and I think nobody's happy to see this because everybody knows that the shipping line made a fortune out of us, whether as business or consumers, because we were forced to end up paying a lot more money for the same amount of cargo that was being imported or exported. But then last year, the rates dropped. And the rates dropped dramatically and brought the business back to, to basically a zero EBIT market. Now, what this tells us is that the shipping line are definitely going to try to increase the rates. And, they're always very, very, I would say, creative in, whether it's a peak season surcharge or it's a disruption surcharge or it's a general rate increase. I mean, you name it, they will be very creative and they'll probably bring some increases to which is not good news, but that's the reality. As a matter of fact, if we look at some of these indexes, so we have the World Container Index, which is an average of all the freight that it's moving across the world. It's an index that represents more or less where the market sits. The index next to it is the Shanghai Containerized Index, which is representing what is the cost of bringing a container from Shanghai to North Europe. Now, that, of course, export out of Asia, it's the biggest trade lane in terms of volume. And of course, that affects dramatically the World Container Index. So if we look at our trade lanes, I mean, probably our biggest trade lane for case goods is Europe and New World Wine for bulk wine. They are not showing the same figures. So there have been increases, but not to the extent that we've seen out of Asia. Just because out of Asia, as I said before, the volumes have surged in the last quarters. So globally, we are seeing increases. The trend is continuing to go up. I think people are trying to also be prepared for the possible strike on the East Coast and have anticipated a little bit the peak season, because at the end of the day, we think these surge, usually the peak season usually would start now, but it actually was anticipated almost 2 months in advance. So we'll see if this is going to keep up. One thing that we didn't talk about is equipment. When we looked at the carriers, I said, MSC represents almost 21% of the global freight. They were number 2 carriers about 2 years ago, and in the last 2 years, they've outgrew Maersk by far. So they're number 1 by far, and MSC is probably the largest asset owner of 20-foot containers. 20-foot containers is very important for this industry, for the bulk industry, because that's what we need for the flexis. But of course, it's also true that most of the shipping lines are not investing as much on new 20-foot containers. That's because for them, it's an additional cost. So when you offload one container from the ship, it's one box. So if a 40-foot container is double the size of a 20, and the movement, for them, it's the same. So the cost of the movement is the same. So it's the double cost, and they don't like to invest in that, which is a problem. And because of that, we are also looking into the possibility of doing flexi tanks in 40-foot containers. So we've developed some flexi tanks. Unfortunately, we haven't tried it out in the US yet because of the weight restrictions that we have here in California. It doesn't allow us to bring us more weight. But we're going to look at the possibility also to reduce that. On the other side, you have the ISO tanks. So those are the tanks that we use primarily for spirits. That's mainly because we're not allowed to use flexi tanks after a certain amount of liters and alcohol content. It becomes dangerous goods, and therefore to be loaded on board, you have to have ISO tanks. The difference between the two is the ISO tanks, you have to think about a closed loop because it's our own assets, where the flexi and the 20-foot container, you can just simply go from A to B. But, at the end of the day, what, as I was saying before, we feel that we are part of this industry, and I think we always listen to ideas and necessities of the industry, and we're always investing, and we have a research and development. We've got different solutions in terms of, multi-layer, single-layer flexis. We have multi-product flexis that are also available. And, because we want to continue to invest and innovate, because, the future is about innovation, but also about responsibility. And if you think about responsibility, then the industry, it burns 3.4 billion CO2 on an annual basis. This is the global industry. And road and sea, they represent about 90% of that. I don't know, probably many of you in your companies already have a roadmap for sustainability. I think this is, it's almost a requirement right now. More in Europe, I would say, that what we're seeing than in the US, but it's coming also in the US. And we have our own, so as part of the DHL group, we want to reduce our emissions by 2030 to less than 29 million tons. So it's a very aggressive target, and we're trying our best to do that. But you in the bulk industry are actually already helping us, just because you are importing bulk. And if you compare to case goods, that's, you know, a container of bulk, it's almost 3 times as much as if you were importing in case goods. We produce, our flexi tanks are produced with recyclable product. And we are happy to say that 95% of our flexi tanks coming into the US are also recycled. And we reuse our bulkhead to make sure that we are as green as possible. We do this also on the UK side. That's because it's one of the most important markets as far as importing bulk, specifically wine. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, I think there is a lot of you that you know, ship, whether it's finished product, import, bulk, and you know, we have a website where, you know, we can keep you up to date and about the disruptions, possible strikes, about you know, what the market trends are. So I mean, please feel free to, you know, check on that website.